And now it's time for Answers with Eric.
And here's your host, Eric Snyder. So good to see you today. If you watched the last video from last week, I just want you to know that I have been wearing this shirt all week long. So I've been wearing this shirt for 1 week. It's amazing how clean it has stayed, is it not? I can't say so much for the smell, but anyhow, I really have not been wearing this shirt for a week. Okay, so today we're going with Acts chapter 16, verses 16 through 30. We had just looked last week where Paul, along with Silas and their newfound friend Luke, have ventured across into Europe. From Asia Minor, they've crossed the Aegean Sea. I think it's the Aegean Sea, isn't it? And they've made their way up to Philippi, where they converted Lydia, the seller of purple, the God-fearing woman, who she and her whole household were baptized into Christ. And so she invites them to stay with her. So here we are. We're still in Philippi. So now with Acts chapter 16, verses 16 through 30, the first question: who do the missionaries meet? So it happened that as we were going to the place of prayer, a slave girl, having a spirit of divination, met us, who was bringing her masters much profit by fortune telling. So I have no idea how good she was at the fortune telling, but she was making, this little slave girl had a spirit of divination, an evil spirit, and she comes across the missionaries. Verse 17, what was she saying? And it's interesting to hear what she saying. I just said she had an evil spirit, but evil spirits often spoke the truth, right? Even with Jesus, they would come and call him Son of the Most High God. This young girl says, these men, these men are bondservants of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation. These men are bondservants of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation. Pretty good message, pretty good, very good reception, it seems like, to have somebody acknowledging that. The next question says, how loud? And it says, the only reference I have for that is she kept crying out. She was crying out. It was loud, whatever she was doing, she was being loud. How often? And that's the next question. Well, she was following them. That's the verse. It mentions that verse 17, following after Paul and us. So she was following them, and she kept crying out. And that is what it following after Paul and us. She kept crying out. She was continuing to cry out. And in the next verse, we'll note now that even in the next verse, it says that she did this for many days. Question, last question for this verse is, was she wrong? Do you think she was wrong? Well, what she was saying was truth. She spoke the truth. She wasn't wrong in saying the truth. But let's see what happens. Question for verse 18, if she was speaking the truth, why do you think Paul was annoyed? Well, wouldn't you be annoyed after 3 or 4 days of this? And it likely was a great hindrance to his ability to teach others and to talk with them. And really, when you think about it, having somebody come along behind you, and if she kept doing this over and over, almost without stopping, perhaps, we don't know how often she was doing it, but she kept doing it. I'm surprised that he put up with it for as many days as he did. And it does say many days. It happened for many days. It wasn't just 1 day. It wasn't just 2 days. It was many days. And so what did he do? Well, he turned and said to the spirit, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And it came out of her that very moment. Excuse me. So he got rid of the spirit. He commanded the evil spirit. It doesn't specify that, but it was an evil spirit, commanded it to come out. Verse number 19, what was the result of the spirit being cast out? Well, her masters, according to this verse, they lost their money maker. And so they grab hold of Paul and Silas. They drag them to the authorities. They're pretty upset. 20 and 21. What do you think about their accusation? So let's look at verses 20 through 21. It says, "And when they brought them to the chief magistrates, they said, these men are throwing our city into confusion, being Jews, and are proclaiming customs which it is not lawful for us to accept or to observe, being Romans." Um, so they make this big accusation. The question specifically says, what do you think about their accusations? So let me tell you what you think. Or wait, maybe I'll tell you what I think. First of all, they're exaggerating. You know, they haven't thrown the city into confusion. They've just caused a little bit of problem with this their money that was going to be coming into them because they cast the demon out of the slave girl. So, and the other thing is that as you look at this accusation, you can see why there were probably not many Jews. We looked at that last week. There were not many Jews living in Philippi because there were just a small group of women that were meeting down by the river to pray. So it's no wonder there were not Jews there. It kind of exposes how prejudiced these people were against the Jews. And they went straight to this claim. You know, they really knew what to do and what to say to get Paul and Silas in trouble. So they went straight to this accusation that what they were speaking was against Rome, and that would have been a big no-no. You know, so the city wouldn't have allowed for their standing with Rome to be threatened. You know, anything. You know, a city they want to be in good standing with Rome, or else the force comes down on them hard. Jerusalem experienced that a lot. So they want to stay in good standing with Rome, and if anybody comes saying anything against Rome, they are going to quickly put it down. And we see that because as we look at verse 22, it says, "Who responds to the accusation?" It doesn't give any kind of indication that any questions were asked or that there were any other witnesses or anything, but it just says that the crowd rose up together against them. So once the crowd hears this, they're just all on. It just sets the place on fire, it seems like. And then the chief magistrates, they're the ones who are going to give the order. The chief magistrates, they tore the robes off. The chief magistrates tore the robes off of Paul and Silas and ordered that they be beaten with rods. And again, you know, when has anybody asked any questions as to, you know, is this what you've done? Is this true? And are there any other witnesses? Do you have anybody to give any support for what you've done? So they just go straight to the beating. Verse 23 says, "Do they beat them with rods?" And yes, they did. They struck them with many blows, according to this verse. "Then what do they do with them? They throw them in prison." Question for 24, what does the jailer do with Paul and Silas? So here the jailer, he throws them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in stocks. So these guys, they want to make sure that Paul and Silas are not going to escape. Inner prison, feet in the stocks. Question for 25, it says, what do we find them doing at midnight? Referring to Paul and Silas. And Paul and Silas, verse 25, you got to read that verse again. "But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners were listening to them." Just a beautiful scene, a desperate situation that is filled with hope because they know God's with them and they can endure it. And so they're singing praise to God, even in dire circumstances. They could have been moaning and groaning because of the beating, but instead they're praising God. 26 says what happens. And we know that this earthquake happens in 26. Do you think the earthquake is a coincidence? So 26, and suddenly, you know, it's very pointed. This is while they were singing. Suddenly there came a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison house were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were unfastened. So was this, earthquake a coincidence? Somebody who doesn't believe in God, they're going to read this and they're going to say, yeah, lucky for them. They got lucky. It was a coincidence if this actually happened, but no, this earthquake is clearly God at work. And since it's a natural occurrence, an earthquake, and people wouldn't have just been able to look and say, oh, it's a miracle. But you could say that this then is the providence of God at work. This God making sure things work out how he wants it. That's what the providence of God is. The providence of God is him working behind the scenes, making things happen that we don't necessarily say, oh, did you see that? It was a miracle. But when the chains were unfastened, this is undeniably a miracle, for this isn't a natural occurrence for chains to just fall off. If there's an earthquake, you might break the chains free from the wall or something, but for shackles around, they were shackled at the feet for those things and everything else to come loose. This was undeniably a miracle. It was just God at work. Verse 27, what had the jailer been doing at midnight? And as you look there, verse 27, it says, when the jailer awoke. So at about midnight, when this all happens, when they were singing and the earthquake happens, it wakes him up. So he had been sleeping. And what does he decide to do? Well, if his prisoners are escaping, particularly if some of them are, that if a prisoner escapes whatever offense they had committed, that jailer was going to be responsible for if he let them escape. So probably there were some people in there with capital crimes, and he knew it, and he knew his reputation was at stake anyhow. He decides he takes out his sword and he's going to kill himself. Verse 28, the question says, how does Paul stop the jailer from committing suicide? In verse 28, it says, but Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, do not harm yourself, for we are all here. We're all here. Don't harm yourself. So Paul stops him. Verse 29, what does the jailer do next? He called for the lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. So he gets the lights, he's shaken up. This is quite an experience he is having and has had. And he goes and he falls down right before Paul and Silas. Verse 30 says, what does the jailer say to Paul and Silas? And what might this indicate that the jailer knew, or what he might have been thinking? Well, and his words are this. And after he brought them out of the inner part of the jail, he said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? What must I do to be saved? This plan of salvation is all through the book of Acts. And here we have somebody coming to Paul and Silas saying, what must I do to be saved? I want to be saved. So what does that tell us about what he might have been thinking? Well, he may have heard the words of the slave girl. She was yelling out, these men are bondservants of the Most High God who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation. He might have been like, okay, well, what is that way? I want to know. So he possibly had heard those words. He might have heard how Paul had cast out the spirit. He might have known that Paul had some powers, that he was able to do some things. So he was interested in that, perhaps, and the message that came with it. And he may have heard them singing before he dozed off. He might have heard the praying, the singing, even before he went to sleep. But I would say, without a doubt, the jailer did not think that earthquake was a coincidence. He knew it was not just, oh, that's crazy that earthquake happened. He knew it was from God. And so he wants to know, what must I do to be saved? What must I do to get right with God? I know I need to do something. So that's the lesson for today, and we all, the whole world is in that situation, as the whole world should be crying out, and whether they do or not, sometimes they need something in their lives to kind of wake them up, like this jailer kind of got shaken up a little bit. But when those things happen, hopefully there's going to be somebody there when they say, what must I do to be saved? What do I have to do to get right with God? I think the whole world thinks that. I think the Holy Spirit draws people to God, to think about God, and to not be able to forget about him until their heart is so hardened that they are just turned. I think that's when you get to the point where people just fight against God. These militant atheists just, if there's no God, why do they worry about if somebody else believes in God or not? The call of the gospel is, I want to share this good news with as many people as possible. Do they think it's, to not believe in God, that's such good news that they just want to share it? It's just a strange thought and strange thing. But I think that really the reason why they're fighting against it is just because they don't want to believe it. And if they can convince somebody else that they're right, that there is no God, then it makes them feel a little bit better too, that there is no God. If you get other people to join them, they're really just fighting against that inner voice that says there is a God. That it's not an inner voice, it's the Spirit that's working within them that says, draw close to God. So the other thing that's interesting too is, and so take that message, share with people, and long for the day that you'll hear somebody say, what must I do to be saved? The other thing I'd ask you to consider with this lesson is Paul and Silas in jail. First of all, question that comes to me is, would I be convicted? Would I be convicted if the accusation were against me that he's a Christian, he believes in Jesus, he is turning people away from the ways of the world? Would I be convicted of that? Would I be convicted of living a life that doesn't fit with the rest of the world? Would I be convicted? And if I were convicted and if I were thrown in jail, would I be singing? If I had been beaten and then thrown in jail is the better question. Would I be singing and praying hymns of praise to God? Would I do that? That's a powerful attitude to have, and it's one that we should have. And I think that we need to consider what we truly believe in, what we truly will stand up for, and that nobody will turn us away from, no matter what the threat, because we're told to fear God, not to fear men. The men can only kill the body, and then they can do no more. But God's the one who can cast the soul into hell. So let's fear God. Let's do what he wants us to do and not worry about what men will do. And that's the encouragement for the lesson today. So the book of Acts, again, it's evangelism. It's believing and sharing what we believe, the good news of Christ.